Hi, everyone. Apologies that we're starting, I guess, 5 minutes before the scheduled time. I guess the schedule was fake news. I know it's bad, sorry. So welcome to our final panel. So glad to see a nice crowd out here. We have an interesting group, a diverse group. We have Matt Baum, who's a professor of public policy and government at the Harvard Kennedy School. Next to him is Brent Kendall, who is a legal affairs reporter in Washington for the Wall Street Journal. And then we have a law professor, Tamara Piety, who is an expert in all kinds of things that intersect with the First Amendment. She didn't start out as a constitutional law scholar, but she's finding herself working a lot in the area of corporate personhood, and we'll be talking about some constitutional issues associated with trying to regulate whatever it is that we mean by fake news. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Matt, who's going to tell us what fake news is, I think.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'm going to resolve that question, what fake news is, but I'm going to talk about what it is a little bit. So as we heard in the last presentation, fake news is nothing new. It's been around for a long time. I had a really cute anecdote that I wanted to begin with to sort of make that point, but I feel like the last presentation kind of stole a little of my thunder, and your Lynn's anecdote was better than mine, so I'm just going to assume that I can stipulate that you all will all accept that it's been around for a long time. But not only has it been around for a long time, but it's also nothing new that people are worrying a lot about fake news. So here I do have an anecdote. Back in 1925, Harper's Magazine published an article called "Fake News in the Public," in which they called it a source of unprecedented danger. So maybe it was an important, influential factor in the 2016 election, but it's unclear if we would be talking about it today if it weren't for really two individuals, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. The main point I'm trying to make inelegantly is that a lot of stuff happens. Some of it is worrisome. Fake news is one of those things that happens and folks are worrying about. But it takes a certain confluence of circumstances to bring an issue, as Walter Lippmann famously said, out of darkness and into the light. And thanks to Putin and Trump, a lot of people, governments, private companies, are having to think a lot about how they're going to respond to the threat, and I'm using air quotes intentionally, posed by fake news, even though some of the most important players, and I suspect you all know who they are, would very much prefer that we not be talking about this at all, and are hoping against hope that we'll stop talking about it. But nonetheless, here we are. So since we are in fact talking about fake news, I'm going to focus most of my comments on a few of the challenges I see in addressing the problem, at least to the extent that there is in fact a problem that needs addressing, and I'll get to that in a few moments. But before I do that, I do want to talk a little bit about how we might think about defining what fake news is, or at least try to offer a definition. As far as I know, there really is no widely accepted definition of fake news, so this is a little bit of maneuvering in real time. For instance, a colleague of mine, Claire Wardle, who runs a nonprofit called First Draft, what they do is they work with media organizations around the world to train journalists to recognize fake news before it gets a chance to take hold. So she has a presentation that she goes around the country, I guess around the world as well, in which she identifies 7 kinds of what she calls misinformation and disinformation. She doesn't like the term fake news, and she keeps telling me I should stop using it. So she'll say F star 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 N star star star. And as I told her, when I see that on the screen, the first thing that comes to my mind is not fake news. But that's different point. Anyway, so the 7 that she identifies, the first is satire and parody. You know, here there's no intent to cause harm, but you could potentially have deception. It can be deceptive in significant part because, especially satire, makes a heavy use of irony, which by definition means saying the opposite of what you mean. And if you don't have the context, if you don't get the joke, you can interpret it as being the opposite of what it's actually saying. And there are surveys showing, for instance, in watching The Daily Show, that conservatives interpreted or conservatives believed, excuse me, the Colbert Report, not The Daily Show, that Colbert really meant what he was saying, and liberals believed, which I'm pretty sure is the truth since he's said so, that he was playing a character and deliberately exaggerating it. So you can have this sort of problem. Misleading content is the second category. This is the deceptive use of information to frame an issue or an individual. The third is imposter content, in which genuine sources are impersonated. The fourth is fabricated content, and that's 100% false and with an intent to deceive. That's sort of an easy one. The sixth is false, which he calls false content, which is genuine information shared with false contextual information. This is probably the most common variety in conventional politics. It's sort of ubiquitous in conventional politics. Think about President Obama saying, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Well, this turned into a meme about how he had lied about what the Affordable Care Act was doing. In fact, what he was talking about was the decision to preserve the employer-based system, which meant for most people, most of the time, it wouldn't force you to change your doctor. But of course, in insurance markets, plans are canceled, doctors come and leave insurance plans, so the change goes on all the time. But that context was completely dropped. I think Obama and his speechwriters would probably stipulate at this point that that wasn't the most artful choice of words. The seventh is manipulated content, which is when genuine information or content is manipulated to deceive. So this is a really nuanced attempt to try and catalog all these different things that might fall into the basket of misinformation or disinformation. I could quibble with some of these, and in fact, I have quibbled with some of these, and talking with Claire, I don't think she's completely nailed it, but nonetheless, I think it's a reasonable cut. The way I think about fake news as distinct from this broader category of misinformation and disinformation is sort of as a subset. I think it, to varying degrees, is touched on in several of these categories, especially the fifth one, fabricated content, and also the last two, false context and manipulated context. But I'd like to be a little bit more specific than that because I think that's kind of a wishy-washy way of trying to narrow it down. So here's a definition that some of my colleagues and I have sort of kind of settled on for the moment in the work that we're doing, and that is fake news is information that mimics the output of the news media in form, but not in organizational process or intent, with the intent in particular to deceive. So for instance, lacking editorial norms and processes to weed out information weed out false information, that is, in favor of true information. So by this definition, what is especially pernicious about fake news potentially is that it manipulates the credibility we invest in standard news outlets in order to use deception to affect belief change. So this definition, I think it's also worth pointing out, would exclude ideologically slanted news. I think there's clearly a fine line if you put false and bias on opposite ends of a continuum. Where do you cross from ideological skew into false? It's not clear. We're really talking about made-up information. But I am admittedly skirting this line in order to gain some measure of clarity. So I wouldn't necessarily claim that this is a generally accepted definition. I think it clearly isn't. I think it's a reasonable approximation of one, and I'm going to sort of stick with it for purposes of today at least, until one of you talks me out of it anyway. Unfortunately, getting to, I think, maybe a more important point, even if we agreed on the definition, there's a good chance that we're not going to agree on the magnitude of the threat. Why is that? Well, in no small measure, it's because we really have no clue about how big the problem actually is. We know it's in the news a lot. We know President Trump tweets a lot about it, usually in the context of lambasting mainstream news outlets like CNN and the failing New York Times, which ironically is enjoying its greatest surge in subscription in about 40 years, thanks to Donald Trump. It also seems to play a central role in the ongoing soap opera of Russian interference in the US election. But we don't really know how much fake news there is. We don't know how many human beings are reading it, liking it, sharing it, or altering their behavior because of it. And all we really have are anecdotes, some of which are really kind of troubling. Like the recent news from Facebook that Russians posing as Americans were buying ads targeting actual Americans in the 2016 election. But still, this is, it's just an anecdote. How many people saw those ads? What, if any, effect did they have? We just don't know. Facebook says it's a small problem. Don't worry about it. After all, we're only talking about $100,000 in a $3 billion election, so why worry? What's 100K in the scheme of electoral things? But they offered exactly zero evidence to back up that claim, and it's not clear what constitutes a small versus a big problem anyway. And the main thing is we don't, just because the dollar amount attached to ad buys sounds pretty small, we have no idea how many people saw those ads or shared the ads. We just don't know. And that brings me to what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about, which is 3 of what I think are the key challenges to try and address the fake news problem, again, at least to the extent that there is in fact a problem. And these are transparency, credibility, and familiarity, and I'm going to talk about each of them. So I put transparency first, partly because I've been sort of leading into that, so it was rhetorically least jarring, but also because I think it's at the end of the day, this is the reason we don't know the breadth or depth of the problem. In particular, the problem here is that the major platforms, especially Facebook, there's no point sort of dancing around that fact, but also Google, Yahoo, and others, largely refuse to share their data. And without access, for instance, to Facebook's data, scholars can't determine how widespread the fake news problem is, how many people encounter fake news, how many share it, let alone what effect it might be having on things like, I don't know, presidential elections. One of the underlying goals of my work in this area, and many of my colleagues and others who are working on this, has been to try to somehow persuade the platforms to work with multidisciplinary groups of independent scholars. And by independent scholars, I mean folks who don't actually draw paychecks from the organization that they're studying, and who haven't signed an agreement stipulating that Facebook would get the right of refusal over anything they might want to publish. And you can imagine doing this through carrots, trying to offer mutual benefits. So I'm down to 3 minutes already. I was just getting on a roll. Or sticks, threatening to shame them or do an end around to figure out how to model their real data. There are several projects right now aimed at trying to get people to volunteer their data so that it might be modeled. If that ever became a credible threat, you might see a change in behavior. But for the time being, these efforts have been, shall we say, less than entirely successful. Turning to credibility, one problem in combating fake news is that fake news is successful in part because of human psychological biases, like confirmation bias or selective attention. As I'm sure most of you know, most people find more persuasive individuals that they like and trust. So if a trusted expert tells you to believe a fake news story, say climate change is a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese, you're more likely to accept it without critical analysis than you would be if that same argument came from someone you didn't trust. So, in my own work, I've looked at reactions to news stories and found, and this won't shock all of you, that Democrats and Republicans are differently persuaded by the same news item depending on whether the masthead says Fox or MSNBC, because there are differing assumptions about the credibility of the source. Similarly, we're more likely to accept as true a story shared with us by a friend than one shared with us by a stranger. So for instance, one maybe unintended consequence of the Facebook model of sharing news items likely increases the impact of fake news simply because it takes advantage of that trust. My friend shared it, so it's probably worth at least considering. One theoretical way of reducing the impact of facilitating the spread, of credibility in facilitating the spread of fake news would be reducing its availability. Accomplishing that goal is really difficult. There are steps that could be taken to move in this direction. Assessing the reliability of news sites rather than individual news stories. This is something that platforms say that they're working on, but they're doing it in secret. So again, we don't know how much of it they've done or intend to do. Because I'm just about out of time, I'm going to move ahead and talk about the third factor, which is familiarity. And I'll end with this. We know from a long-standing body of research, which recently has been applied directly to the issue of fake news, that people are more likely to accept something as true if it's familiar to them than if it's not. So, for instance, if I encounter a headline in a newspaper that says fact check, childhood vaccinations cause autism, I may or may not have read the article, I may or may not read the article rather, but if I encounter that claim that childhood vaccines cause autism again, I'm more likely to believe it the second time because it's familiar to me, having originally read the prior headline. If I did read the first article and it said the claim is false, I'm likely to forget that detail and just remember something about a connection between childhood vaccination and autism. Even if it says in the headline, fact check, claims that vaccines cause autism are false, same thing happens. Sometime down the road, I remember that there was this association, but I don't remember the details. So it makes it really hard to correct fake news. So let me just move to sort of takeaways from this, and I'll leave it there. At least for me, the main takeaway is that this is a really difficult problem to solve. I can't really define the scope of the problem. I can't access the necessary data to establish the scope of the problem or to investigate the efficacy of the several potential fixes I suggested or others. And to make matters worse, the most obvious fixes seem likely to make the problem worse rather than better. There is, to end on a positive note, there is some progress being made on all of these fronts, although it's very halting. So I think at least from a technical and policy perspective, and I'll leave to the others in the room and on this panel the legal and constitutional questions, which are legion in and of themselves. There is hope that we can mitigate the problems to at least some extent, if not necessarily eliminate it altogether. Again, assuming that there is in fact a problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Brent, you can now tell us what it's like in the trenches.
I'll start by saying thanks for having me, and thanks to all of you for sticking around on a pretty Friday afternoon and here to listen to us talk. Before talking about fake news, I thought part of what I would do would sort of go through a little bit about what it's like to do real news now. What's changed, what's different. And Matt ended on a positive note, and so I will start on a positive note. I mean, in some ways, and Lynn was talking about this earlier, there are challenges in these times, and if you're a publisher and you're worried about liability, I mean, there's things that, to be concerned about, but I mean, at least from where I sit, it's a great time to be a reporter, and that's sort of how I approach each and every day that I do this, and I don't really do things any differently about how I approach my job for the most part than I did before. So I will just start with saying that. Going through some of where we are and then how this intersects with this whole fake news phenomenon. I mean, there have definitely been changes, both good and bad, since the election. On the good side, there are a lot of new readers. We have subscriptions are up. People are engaged with the news. I mean, it's not just print. I mean, it's online. It's television. People. It's nice to see an audience, realize that what we do matters, and they're looking to you for information, so you have more readers and you have more engaged readers. So it's a nice reminder for everybody that what we do is important and relevant. One of the challenges with some of the new readers, I do feel like there is some segment of people who now are paying attention, maybe who didn't as much before, didn't interact with media as much before, and don't really understand how exactly it is we do our jobs. So that can be a challenge on multiple fronts. I mean, I hear from readers a lot more now than I ever did before, I think. Our emails are at the bottom of all our articles. I'm on Twitter. There's lots of ways for people to get in touch with you. There's a wide range of questions people ask. And I think there are some basic misunderstandings from some people, too. One of the things we talked about earlier was anonymous sources and things of that nature. I mean, it does seem that there's some segment of a readership who thinks that this is somehow new or different, or something that the media now does, with Trump as president, which is just not true. I mean, particularly, I've been in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, been a reporter for 15 years, and you can't really do what we do without using anonymous sources. You like to get people on the record. You like to tell readers as much as you can about who is informing your reporting, but I mean, that's just not always possible. And so, when you have people out there saying, well, if you see this story and they just say a person familiar with the matter said this, or people familiar with the matter, or somebody close to the White House, that they're just making that up. And I mean, obviously, it's not true. Particularly for credible news organizations, I mean, there are multi-levels of checks. And, the only thing I really have when I do my job is my credibility. And once you've lost that, you're kind of done. So, you get things from people and you try to cross-check them, and you have editors, and you have editors above them, and then you have final editors, and you have the legal team if you have sensitive legal stories. And so, I mean, it's, at least for big news media organizations, I mean, it's just not, it's not even really a possibility. So, I'd say that's one misunderstanding. Some of the things in particular that, I've had to deal with, and some of this is where some of the fake news discussion comes in. We were already seeing this phenomenon anyway, where sort of people's consumption of media is splintered. A lot of people gravitate more towards the sorts of, news outlets or, things that are sort of news and sort of opinions that they kind of believe in. And we've had this explosion of outlets, right, with blogs and online things. And, while it's hard to start and maintain a profitable newspaper, like having a website and, writing stories, not that hard. And particularly if you consume news via Facebook, Twitter, and there's just this plethora of sources out there, it's not always easy for people to distinguish what's what, because they probably not really had a whole lot of experience with a lot of them to begin with. So we've had this splintering anyway, and then, so people will send me things that they've read, and it's normally not fake news where the Russians made it up and posted it on Facebook. I mean, the much more gray areas, things that, maybe have a kernel of truth in them, or the analysis is wrong, you take facts that are right, and, people will send you stuff, and, well, why didn't you say it that way? And they'll send you these articles, and there is some segment of, and I don't know how representative the people you hear from reader-wise are representative of the general population, because people are busy, and I assume most people, don't have the time to sort of let you know how they feel, but, some people, you get stuff from, you're basically, why do you hate America? You're the enemy of the state. It all proceeds for this assumption that you have some kind of agenda, which is also not true. And then you get people who really, and I like this sort of thing. I mean, who'll say, well, why did you write it this way? Why did you not emphasize this more? And it really will read your material, critically. And, I think scrutiny of us is good. I mean, we want to build credibility with readers. And so I like that, and I try to respond to people like that. I mean, so while scrutiny is good, what I do worry about a little bit, and this all is within this context, is general skepticism of journalism as an institution, which, in a general time when there's questions about all sorts of institutions in America and how healthy they are and how they're holding up, and I'd hate to get to the point where there was a critical mass of people who somehow felt like, reporters, had an agenda, or somehow there was an illegitimacy to what we do, or that there was a slant to it, and for that reason, even things like when you hear discussions about, the media's war on Trump, that makes me incredibly uncomfortable. I don't feel like I mean, the current environment presents its challenges, but every administration, every environment does. They're just different from time to time. But, you know, I'd like to think we cover him and the administration just like we would anybody else. And, you know, our job is to shine light on things and to hold people accountable. I mean, it doesn't mean that we're at war with them. I mean, I suppose if we got to the point where there's a push to throw reporters in jail for sources and to sort of curb First Amendment freedoms and curb access to government officials, and we end up with a less transparent environment. I mean, of course, those are the sorts of things that in my line of business we're going to be concerned about and want to push back on and have a healthy debate. But in general, I don't love that sort of metaphor. So within the context of that, I just thought I would talk about where we are and how people consume news, and this gets more into the fake news thing. I mean, it's been astounding in the 15 years since I've done this, the change in how people consume news. I mean, Facebook is obviously a huge thing. I mean, we have internal presentations from time to time, which I can't really share the details of, but they generally show, I mean, you can look on a graph, the number of people who consume our product and other products over time through Facebook or Twitter. I mean, it's just astounding how many people get their news through that. And so that presents opportunities. You know, it also presents challenges. You know, the other thing that I think is different, I mean, I don't know how you consume Facebook. I mean, a lot of people now get their news on their phones, right? So, and we're trying to figure out how you tell stories on phones and how you tell stories to people with less attention spans. And I don't know how you all consume news or use your phone or use Facebook, but I mean, you're scrolling along and, you know, maybe there's some fake news article posted. You're just looking at a whole scroll of stuff, and so you'll see little bits and pieces of it, but you don't necessarily stop and like overly consume everything, right? So, I mean, you may have come across some stuff that's not entirely real or sort of slanted in a mixture of stuff that's entirely real. Or even if you're reading something that I wrote on your phone, you know, you get push alerts from other news outlets and somebody liked your Instagram post and you're getting texts from friends about where you're going to meet for dinner. So you're sort of, you know, you're doing lots of different things at once. You have divided attention spans. And so I also think that affects the way people sort of internalize what they're reading, and it can affect their just impressions of what we're reporting and what they think sort of the current landscape is and things of that nature. So, you know, I think those are challenges. I mean, you know, it's good to have more readers, but the way people consume media now is more of a challenge, I think, for all of us. You know, but at the same time, these outlets that have made it, like Facebook, that have connected us to a lot more readers, are the reason that we have had this spread and this sort of phenomenon with fake news, you know, that is arguably of a character different than what we've seen before. You know, and I'm not sure what you really do about it. I mean, my concern is that in the process, when you have all these different streams that are just in individuals' consumption streams, that it, you know, has the potential at least to diminish what I do and create more suspicion of media generally. You know, and that's a concern. And, you know, the ability of people to distinguish between, you know, what's real and what's not, and then this whole area that's in between. You know, I think that's a challenge for a lot of us. You know, as far as how to fix, again, you know, this is the other thing I will mention before I get to that. The other thing people can be suspicious of that factors somewhat into not fake news, but sort of this middle ground, particularly at this day and age. Some people don't like the thought that sort of the media is filtering the news, or you know, and the argument or the criticism of what you hear some of the time is, you know, I don't want you to tell me what to think. I just want you to tell me what happened, and I'll figure out what I think for myself. And so I entirely agree with that up to a point. You know, part of your job in being in the media is to mediate things. You know, if I've had a beat and I've covered an area for 10, 12, 15 years, I have some historical experience with it. And so part of what I feel like I'm supposed to do is tell you why this is important or why you should care about this. And is this novel or new, you know, or is this something that has come up previously, you know? So there is a line there, and, you know, we can have debates about that, but, you know, you do hear from some people on that front that they want you to do less of telling them things as opposed to just reporting how it is. So, you know, that's a debate. We even have that debate, within the industry. And so I think newsroom discussions like that are healthy. But again, I don't feel like at the end of the day, we don't do anything that really differently than we ever did before. As far as the fake news issue itself, and I agree, I mean, there's no way to know how big of a problem it is, how much of an influence it has. I mean, to the extent it is a problem, there have been different things discussed, all of which sort of give me a little bit of pause. So if Facebook wants to, so let's talk about a couple. So Facebook, what if we had Facebook labeling things that they thought were fake, or you just put some kind of disclaimer on them? This is a disputed topic, a disputed article. Well, I mean, there's an argument to be made. Do you want them deciding that? I mean, some things are clearly over the line, but then there's this huge gray area, and who's to say in certain circumstances what's disputed and what's not? So I mean, that's of concern. I've also heard arguments. The Federal Trade Commission, which has broad authority to protect consumers, that maybe they could police fake news, something akin the way they do false advertising, and whereas if you have something out there that's a get-rich-quick scheme or some like diet pill that doesn't really work and they can step in and sort of shut a website down, maybe they could do something like this for fake news. But, I think it would give people pause to have a government agency deciding what is and isn't fake news and who to go after. So I'm not sure that really works either. I mean, we do have the libel law, I'm not sure that's, unfortunately, again, all these things have potential pitfalls to them. I mean, for fake news and, the stuff that's most outlandish and has come from people who published it in Russia, I mean, you're going to have a hard time getting at them anyway. And if you're a public official that has been, slandered through this process, are you going to take the time to sue somebody and go up here in court? I mean, that seems unlikely too. And then we can also talk, I mean, there's this general debate about how much protection there is for fake news, whether it's protected under the First Amendment. We can talk about commercial speech. If you look at recent case law, I mean, the courts are pretty robust in protecting even speech that's clearly false. We had a Supreme Court case called Alvarez a few years back where the court invalidated the Stolen Valor Act, which made it a crime to lie about possessing military medals. So the court struck that down. There was a case out of Ohio that made a trip to the Supreme Court and then went back to the Sixth Circuit. Ohio had a false political speech law that criminalized people from saying blatantly false things about candidates and campaign materials. And the Sixth Circuit struck that down and said, that was problematic too. So I mean, it seems going down that road in this debate, at least to me, is going to be largely a non-starter. And with that, I will close.
Thank you. So I'm going to pull your slides up, Tamara. Okay. And now that we kind of have a definition, kind of know what the problem is, know what it's like to do real news, Tamara's going to tell us all the law and solve all the problems for us. Right?
That's kind of a big challenge.
Okay. And is there a clicker?
Yes.
Let me just turn it into, is this going to work? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Well, there's so much to cover. I don't think I can answer any of those big questions, but I feel a little bit like this is, the Ghostbusters. Who are you going to call? We've heard this role of this call, this really stirring call to, the press's First Amendment responsibilities, and that's something I agree with, and I think the Supreme Court actually ought to make a better distinction between freedom of expression and freedom of the press, but it hasn't done that right now, and we have this big problem that there is, not clear who's going to pay for it to do this, which is, if you leave it to the market, most news organizations are under a lot of pressure. As a note, the Wall Street Journal and The Economist are behind paywalls, so a lot of that stuff is not going to be freely available to people who want to know. That's been one response to try to get to some economically sustainable model. There's been a lot of others, which I will talk about, but I mean, basically you have a couple of models, the market system or some sort of public support, and public support obviously runs the risk of this same issue about government control. I think we're seeing several different problems, though, that arise from what I believe, and I have written about now for over a decade, is a fundamental confusion between the marketplace, Simpliciter, and the marketplace of ideas. And that when you confuse these two and you treat them as if they were the same, you get what we have now. And I think there was a time, maybe a golden age, maybe I'm fooling myself, that we had a little bit better grasp on the distinction between these two. I'll talk a little bit about that, but I think that has been responsible for this kind of problem where we have a problem about knowing what's true. We've seen the credibility of major institutions that might generate truthful information, the press, universities, researchers, scientists, and so forth, have their credibility undermined because of the growth of what I think, in retrospect, historians might say is the major, sort of social and economic industry of the 20th century and now the 21st century, and that is the propaganda industry. That is advertising, public relations, PR, the big umbrella of marketing that has bled into every aspect of our life. It is pervasive, and it's so pervasive that it's largely invisible to us. So I'm going to have my own sort of like little taxonomy for this that's not quite as nuanced as Matt's colleague, but I'll just say that when we talk about fake news, we're probably talking about a couple of things. False stories, that is, things that are factually not true, and what their motivation may be for posting them and so forth is, open. Then we have a whole category of things that look like, information that are not exactly news, but I would call this sponsored research that has been generated by universities or think tanks, but the people that are generating it are getting paid to create this sort of appearance of a debate. And, this was something that the tobacco industry used for 30 years. And, for them, they postponed the awful day when the hammer would come down, and they're still, sort of managing to postpone that. And then promotion masquerading as news. So we have a lot of things happening in news, manipulation of leaks. So we've heard about that, of like actual leaks, and then things the government wants to put out there but doesn't want to take responsibility for. So like Judith Miller's reporting on the Valerie claim. We have a problem that for-profit news media has got a novelty bias. So, that's why you don't see the news stories about happy things, because that's, things went right today. The sun came up in the east. That's not news. Things going badly is news, but that does create some kinds of problems. One of the things that, a pure marketplace might get you is cat videos, right? So, what do people pay for? It's not always bad news. Also, we have editorial judgments going on already, and we want them to go on, I would say, about what to put in the newspaper and what not to put in the newspaper. And we see a lot of financial pressures on people to do that. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because time is short, but we have this pressure is going on at universities with funders wanting to structure research a particular way, shutting down clinics that, that do social justice kind of litigation, and, individual scholars even. There was no norm in law to disclose funding, but I found out probably now a decade ago when I got approached by an NGO to do a paper, and they said, we'd like you to write a law review article, but we'll like to pay you to write a law review article. I was like, really, this is a thing? I didn't know anybody would do that. My university does give me, summer research money and stuff, but that's different. They actually probably they have no control over the content, and they might actually prefer that I write about something different and less controversial than what I actually write about. But because there was no norm of disclosure, we actually see a lot of law review articles that were generated, and it starts to make it look like there's a consensus. There's a, all the smart people agree that this is important to do, but money is going to challenge channel that, right? It's like water finding its level. You're not going to have money on both sides of those issues, or at least not as much. But the third thing is what I am most concerned about. That's things like pay for posts, so review sites like, Travelocity or Yelp or things like that. People going on review sites and being paid to put on good reviews, Amazon, good reviews, bad reviews, which then generates the pressure for the host to try to do some quality control, because people care about whether this is a genuine review, right? Multi-level marketing, so trying to leverage the people of your friendship network to sell you, diet products or exercise programs. This is all the sort of brand called you. We're being encouraged to think of ourselves as a personal brand. Trump is a brand. He's like been a genius marketer. That might be the only thing that he's a genius at, but he's definitely a genius marketer. And we have this other kind of marketing, stealth marketing, guerrilla marketing, and something that is of particular concern when it comes to the press and using the press as this First Amendment bastion, and that is native advertising. For those of you who don't know what native advertising is, I don't know if I can get this. Can you click on that? Native advertising, according to the Interactive Advertising Bureau, is advertising that, quote, delivers ads that are so cohesive with page content, assimilated into the design, and consistent with the platform that the viewer simply believes they belong. Okay, now why are they doing this? I'll tell you why they're doing that. Because of the incredible barrage of advertising, and consumers hate advertising, and it's an axiom of faith in the marketing community. People hate advertising. What do we got to do? We got to got to blast through the clutter and make ourselves different. One way to make ourselves different is to make you think that it's news. I submit to you, and I have done an essay that I called Killing the Golden Goose for a thing that was done in Sweden, and all the proceedings were published in a book called Blurring the Lines, about this kind of problem of promotional content looking like news, that what they wanted to do was leverage the credibility of media, of like news media, to sell a product, to get past the skepticism that was true of people's approach to ads. They approach ads as, inherently untruthful because they are interested. If you get past that skepticism, then you might have people believe you more. The problem is that once they get into it, at some point, if they wake up to what this is, oh, this is a paid post, what you may have is that rather than getting, you may have a short-term fix for your product that time, but the long-term thing may be that you bring down the general trust of all media down to the level of advertising. And I think that's kind of the environment that we're in now, is that people just don't trust research institutions. They don't trust universities. They don't trust government, and they don't trust the news. This piece here, why women inmates, why the male model doesn't work, appeared on the New York Times site. You can see way up at the top, right under the New York Times logo, is a little tiny thing that says paid post. This was a product of T-Brand Studios, which is a division that creates content like this. This was done for Netflix. Can you
scroll down?
Yeah. It's beautifully done. The Interactive Advertising Bureau kind of points to this as an ideal type of content of this kind of quality. And it's interesting and informative in some ways, although I would note that they put an awful lot of emphasis on whether or not women have access to cosmetics in prison, which may be a tie-in to other advertisers, right, other than some of the other topics that they might pick up on. But at the end of the day, the editorial side of the newspaper had nothing to do with this content, but the way it's designed and looked a lot like some of the things that we saw around the election, these sort of interactive pieces that, look like assessments of the election and.
So this was an ad for the show Orange is the New Black?
This was an ad for the show Orange is the New Black, right. Sorry.
Want to go this?
Yeah, get it. Okay, so I have already talked about where I think, oops.
Sorry.
I think one of the problems is we're in a deeply troubling kind of era of knowledge generation. That is, we seem to assume that democracy requires an informed voter, but we're poisoning the well of that information stream and making it difficult for it to work when people don't trust any of the sources that they used to trust at some point in time. Now, I would say that part of that is for good reason. Many of these institutions, government, universities, and so forth, betrayed some of the trust, and so that's part of how we got here as well. But let me talk a little bit about what the answer is. It's not going to be very satisfying because it's not much of an answer, but since we have talked about New York Times versus Sullivan, I think it's really important. You're going to have to bear with me here a little bit about some doctrine. To understand what's so different about protection for advertising and commercial speech than what was protected in New York Times versus Sullivan, even though what it was an ad. It was not an ad to sell a product. It was a political ad. It's what's known as issue advertising. And it was issue advertising by an NGO, by a membership organization, not by a for-profit corporation that organizes its voting on the basis of number of shares. That's, the more capital you have, the more representation you have. One of the things that the court said in New York Times versus Sullivan is that the democracy needs breathing room. I would submit to you that fraud in the marketplace does not need any breathing room. I think the FTC was mentioned. I think we can see that a lot of the examples of the kind of false advertising proliferate. The FTC is clearly not being the hammer that it might be. So that we might have a problem that democratic processes are not really well kept to handle or that we need to confront. And that is that expertise is not necessarily democratic. When we're looking at a lot of things like law, medicine, climate change, weather, economics, maybe economics we can put to one side, these things are not, it's like you don't want to take a vote like on climate change, really. Climate change, is that a thing? Everybody, it's like if you want to have enough trust in the people that do know something about it to formulate policy that's based on that actual fact. And I don't know how to get there reliably by preserving the sort of neutrality that we have towards the whole the things that are encompassing First Amendment that we currently have, that is content neutrality and speaker neutrality. I would say that we need to think differently about content by a for-profit corporation, and we need to think differently about content that is essentially, no matter what the form is that it takes, even if it takes what looks like a letter to the editor or something, is something that's intended to affect the stock price of a for-profit corporation, that's intended to sell products, and is not intended to be a legitimate participation in the democratic process. I know that's controversial, but that New York Times versus Sullivan set up the sort of black letter law for strict scrutiny with respect to the things that are covered by the First Amendment. In the commercial speech doctrine, when it was introduced in 1976, it actually flipped that and said that in order for commercial speech to get protection, it first needed to be truthful. It wasn't even going to get protection unless it was truthful. And then there was this intermediate scrutiny standard. What we've been seeing since the 90s is migrating ever closer to something that looks like Sullivan for marketing. And I submit to you that that's how we get Frank Luntz and his dial studies. It's like, hey, if we use death tax instead of estate tax, people will hate it and they'll vote against it. These are techniques, the manipulation of the cognitive limitations and bounded rationality this is all research that came from marketing and from psychologists who are working on marketing research. And I think you know, one way to think about that is a gigantic, unregulated experiment on human subjects. And we're seeing what the results of that are. I would say, just close with this. Because of that, because some of these things, there are some things that are really, truly, purely opinion about what reasonable people might differ, and particularly your standpoint and so forth. And then there's gravity. Gravity doesn't matter. It doesn't care whether you believe in gravity or not. If I try to walk off this platform, I will fall down, right? A lot of stuff is in the middle. Climate change arguably might be in the middle, and we don't have a feedback loop to tell us that we're wrong about that. That's long enough for any individual lifespan. We need to think of a solution to this and start being willing to bite the bullet about making these distinctions, because I will just say that in another case, another First Amendment case, one of the dissenting justices admonished us that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. It seems to me that what we see right now is a lot of behavior that seems like many of the leaders of industry don't think there's any tomorrow. They don't think about, you know, well, what's going to happen next year, or they are only thinking about the next quarterly report. They don't care about whether the nag factor is a bad thing to intervene between parents and children. They don't care. It's like, hey, I just got to meet the shareholders' demand. Hey, I just got to get elected. Oh, I don't, you know, this is beyond my pay grade. But unless we solve this, we're in big trouble. Thank you. I wanted to say one other thing. Lili Levy is the expert. She wrote a fantastic article on fake news. So if you want to look on something about fake news, look at Lili Levy. She couldn't come today because of being in Miami, but she's my professor at Miami, and she's great.
So before I open it up to questions, I think I want to make one observation, which is this. It seems like, picking up from all three presentations, we're left with possibly, to the extent we believe that there is a thing that we can categorize as fake news and disinformation and propaganda, and to the extent we think that it's a problem that needs solving, it looks like there's three categories or three approaches. The first is attempting to educate people so they become better consumers. So what is the problem with that? One of the problems I think Brent describes really well is the way in which we consume, right? If we're consuming on our phone while all this other stuff is coming in, it makes it difficult for our minds to distinguish between credible sources of information and less credible ones, even people who are older like us. So imagine what it's like as people coming to age in this environment. So just by analogy, there was a time when we all knew the difference between fake news and real news. Fake news was at the checkout counter at the supermarket. That's those thin paper magazines, you know, like the National Enquirer and whatever that other one was, and they had pictures of aliens on it and all kinds of lies, right? And we understood that that was fake news, and that it, you know, that maybe they didn't get sued for libel because it wasn't worth it, and some of it was just ridiculous. And we knew that, and you know what? At the checkout counter, they weren't selling the New York Times right in the same stand, and the Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe, and whatever, right? We knew that these things were available and they were different, right? Now they're literally in the same device, threaded in through and mediated through our friends' feeds. So the problem is we're already training people not to be able to have some sort of flags to distinguish between what might be credible and what's not. I think the other problem is that people just aren't, even smart people just aren't very good at using common sense. I can't tell you how many times I get Facebook messages from friends saying, you know, these different hoaxes, like, watch out, I've got the name of this so-and-so, and you know, if they ever send you something, they're gonna infect your whole computer, you know what I mean? So press down this. So it takes 2 seconds to Google from your phone to find the word hoax in the person's name, and then there's like, you immediately fact check that that was a hoax and don't do it. So like, it's amazing, right? People don't, they take the time to send it to everybody in their address list, which has got to take more time than Googling and finding out, right? So this is a problem. The other problem with, so that's, we can think of other problems with educating folks to be more skeptical. Part of it is what Tamara has raised, which is we're not so good at trusting even trusted news sources to the extent that there is this intermingling when there didn't used to be between, you know, advertising and editorial. Okay, then we have, let's let the platforms police it, is one thing we're talking about. We're also seeing that these notices, and I read an article, see, I'm just as bad, but I have not read the underlying study to see if it's empirically sound, but I read a headline that indicates that the disclaimers, maybe it was in Politico, you guys can tell me, that the disclaimers that you might put on a Facebook website saying, hey, look out for this news, aren't really effective. Actually, I also just heard this guy sitting next to me say something like that too, similarly, which is the, you know, the affirmation, not confirmation bias, but the familiarity bias, that we sort of start forgetting, if something is just prevalent enough, we start forgetting that it was false or what it said about it. So that's another problem with the platforms educating us or policing this situation. The third thing could be government regulation, but all of us are very fearful of trying to draw some of these lines in the gray areas. I mean, it's very, in some cases, something is clear-cut commercial speech. In other cases, something is not. But what we're talking about in here, all these gradations in between, you know, I'm quite nervous about having the government policing those lines. So those are some observations. Maybe I'll ask the panel, do you have any idea of what solutions, you know, we don't have the data, so how can we come up with full solutions, but what are your instincts for how to solve this problem? And then questions from the audience. Starting just going down the line.
Okay. So actually, just to pick up on one of the comments you made, I would go further than to say that tagging stories as potentially false or misleading or contested not only does it not make the problem better, but it can make the problem worse in multiple respects. One, for instance, both Facebook and Google have invested in doing this. There are some anecdotes of Facebook stories that were labeled as having been flagged as potentially misleading. Some activists who liked the story saw this and alerted all of their followers, share it now, share it quickly and widely, you know, and just basically blew up the story because they were afraid it was going to be suppressed. And that's happened a few times, so it's actually backfired and had the reverse effect. So yeah, I didn't get to, because I was droning on and on, I didn't get to all of the things I wanted to say about potential fixes. You know, one that I alluded to that I didn't fully flesh out is what Google has been sort of teasing with and dancing with is this notion of trying to move false stories farther down in the search returns. Now, the difficulty with that is there's a massive processing problem when you're assessing reliability at the level of individual story. And it's not clear that they can do this anywhere near quickly enough to prevent these stories from being widely shared. But if you can substitute the source for the news item, then it becomes a little bit more feasible. So you can imagine either human-generated or maybe human-assisted, machine-generated scoring of the reliability of the content from sites that's constantly evolving. And that can change from day to day or hour to hour, with the basic notion that if you get a high score in false to true, that ratio, then you're going to be knocked down some degree in search returns. And look, if that ratio changes, then that suppression changes. Now, the devil's in the details. How do you accurately establish, how do you code this in a sort of somehow politically neutral, unbiased way that isn't going to provoke its own backlash? And I don't think there's an easy, obvious answer to that, especially as long as facts have a bias of their own, as apparently today they do. But there are a number of, this is just one example, but there are a number of things like this. With one other I'll mention, then I'll stop. With the familiarity issue, why not have a headline? I mentioned the autism and link to vaccines. Have a headline, fact check assessing rival claims about the causes of autism. and leave the business about vaccines to the middle of the story, or to even down below, farther into the story. There's nothing that says you have to scream the false claim in the headline. So hopefully there are going to be some studies, empirical studies, to see if this affects what people take away from it in the not too distant future. So there are things that could potentially help.
That's great. Thanks. What about you, Brent?
I guess a couple of more observations that I would make. I mean, certainly media literacy is important. We want discerning readers. I don't know. I'm not sure that it's altogether different than it has been previously. I mean, I think some of the concerns or challenges predate the current era we're in. I mean, we, for a long time, sort of been moving towards this kind of news as infotainment or entertainment sort of thing. Maybe readers are partly to blame for that. I mean, I think my industry is partly to blame for that. I mean, we want to do more than entertain people, but you do want people to read what you write, and you want to write things that they're going to find engaging. And we're all still trying to figure out how to make money online, and you want to reach a large audience, right? And so, a 3,000 word piece on some famine or really intricate policy debate on something that doesn't have like a nice common man face to put on. I mean, those are stories that people don't read as much as ones that you see in your Facebook feed real quick and think, oh, that's interesting, and you hit on that. And so in some ways I wonder if that generally has made us less discerning at times. Again, I don't know necessarily how you fix that. I mean, I think internally, we need to continue to challenge ourselves, do the best work we can, and to focus on important topics, and then hope that in that process you can engage readers. I mean, the other thing, clarity sells. People like clear answers to things, but things aren't always clear, and so a lot of it is complicated. And when you write stories, well, there's this side is this side is that. There's no clear answers. These are hard questions. Again, I don't know that people always want to read those stories as much as when you can say, this is good, or this is bad, or this is how it is. But then back when I was in journalism school, I had a professor who said, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And the same basic rule still applies, but, we do have this temptation that those are the sorts of stories that people really gravitate to. And, once in a blue moon, something turns out to be unbelievably true, but a lot of times, things are more complicated. And, I think it's always a challenge to present clear, important stories to readers that are compelling and that are challenging at the same time.
Thanks. Tamara.
Wow. Well, I think one of them is, as I've said, to try to distinguish for-profit corporate speech, and not only in the sort of speech news area, but also in the environment of election. So I think really election law reform and lobbying by industry to get some benefits, but then a separate treatment for the press, because of course a lot of the press is a for-profit entity, but I don't think it ought to be owned by conglomerates like Time Warner. I think we ought to have some corporate law reform that would pull out, if we're going to create a separate role for the press, I think maybe it should be, and get some government subsidies, not editorial control, but some, I think there are examples in other countries that are not necessarily authoritarian of some public subsidies. I think we ought to not have for-profit institutions like for-profit universities. I think that's a real problem, and it presents a real problem of consumer protection problems. So maybe if we start shoring up the credibility of these and uncoupling them from, sort of personal profits, maybe people will trust them more. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's all speculation at this point. We don't have a lot of good data.
So thanks. So more money to NPR and PBS?
Right, or like BBC, I don't know. So.
Great. There must be some questions. Kathleen, can we bring her the mic?
Well, while we're getting over there, I'll just say one thing in response to that. On the for-profit media thing, mean, we've had for-profit media for a long time, but you can argue that there are concerns about that. But it's not new, and while there may be some downsides, I mean, there are some upsides too, which I would just, we're in the business of selling newspapers, right? And one way you sell newspapers, people like scoops. If you have stories that other people don't have, you have hard-hitting things that are worth people paying for a subscription, that's what drives people to subscribe to your paper. And so, my bosses, they want to be profitable. And so you hire more people, particularly in this age when people are really, really interested in hard-hitting news, who are going to, dive into these sorts of topics. So there are upsides. Sort of the market forces promote good products and can promote good products and good journalism.
Yeah. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have for-profit media. I guess what I'm saying is that it should be uncoupled from corporate parents who do other businesses, and that perhaps they, in addition to their ad revenue, they need to have some floor of some subsidies that would not make them so susceptible to pressure from advertisers. Okay. And that's
okay. So we got a couple people who want to talk, but I just want to say one thing. I don't know if state-owned media is where we should also be heading. State-run media. I mean, anyway. But okay. Yes, Kathleen.
Given the insights from, I guess, social science or psychology, and I'm just thinking of the confirmation bias that you were talking about earlier, and thinking about how fact-checking has expanded, certainly in this country and actually internationally recently. What recommendation who has anyone worked up a series of recommendations based on these social science insights on how fact-checkers should actually present the results of their work? Because you're making me think that it may be quite counterproductive as currently presented.
So the answer is yes. Well, not just myself and my colleagues, but a number of people are thinking about that and have ideas about it, and there are proposals for experiments, and here's how we could get at this. I would say a couple of things. Firstly, I feel pretty comfortable saying that fact-checking, as it has evolved thus far, has been almost completely ineffective, and in many cases made the problem worse for the reasons that I've said. It is never going to be a panacea. Because you've got to avoid a fundamental mistake, and this is true with civic education and the benefits, which I think it's news literacy is a good thing and it can help, but this assumption that people are consuming news to be informed as opposed to feel good. Some people some of the time want to be informed, but most people most of the time consume news in one way or another to feel good. And there are different things that make you feel good, but being told that you're wrong is not one of them. So the answer is yes. I think there's also, there are people who have ideas and such proposals, I promise, will be forthcoming. The most sort of successful fact-check organizations are deeply conflicted, because they don't really want to be told that what they're doing is not working. So, I have Kathleen Hall-Jamieson sitting, she's a fellow at my center right now, so she's sitting 2 doors down from me. She runs one of the most successful fact-check sites in the country, and I'm trying to think of a way to approach her and say, hey, do you think maybe you'd let us do a little testing on the efficacy of your fact checks to see, which types of stories are successful? And I think it's maybe a 50-50 shot that she's going to be interested in doing it, but we'll see.
And maybe she's watching our live stream. So.
I hope she's interested in doing it, but we'll see.
I think talking about fake news, you can't really talk about it in the current context without some reference to the historical context in terms of lowest common denominator news coverage, or a race to the bottom, or dumbing things down. If you go back to Richard Nixon and the pumpkin patch and the microfiche that he, demonstrated for the cameras, that was compelling television, and that begins the juices flowing, whether you're a public broadcaster or a private broadcaster. And you jump forward to the Iraq War, where the Downing Street memo talks about sexing things up There are newsrooms now where reporters will refer to other reporters and say, can you sex that story up? They may be doing that consciously or unconsciously. We know that there is the tyranny of the short clip where when
So can I just cut you? I appreciate your comments. We only have a few minutes left, so do you have a question for the panel?
My only question would be, what about the issue, for example, in terms of you were asking for solutions or possible solutions? If you think about putting clips or quotes higher in a story, you may give more opportunity to educate, as it were, rather than waiting innumerable numbers of paragraphs for description or editorial comment, and then your readers or listeners or whatever they happen to be would know much sooner what it is that the subject is. So, you know, the panel could talk about that.
Great, thank you. I mean, why don't we take, just, let's see, let's take 2 more questions in a row, and then we will just take your good question about maybe moving up the facts of the story instead of making it, you know, packaging it or framing it, and then these other 2 questions, and then the panel can address those. Who had their hand up next? Over light blue shirt.
Hi there. So it seems to me that maybe for the first majority of our democracy, it was in a print era where our citizens were willing to give up that filtering that you were talking about to the newspaper editors, and it seems to have worked fairly well. And now we're in an age where that's no longer always the case. And you're saying you don't really feel comfortable having government do it, don't really see if you want to have Facebook doing the filtering. So we're left with every citizen being their own editor. They have to make these decisions that used to be made in an editorial room, what's right and what, you know, what's fact, what isn't. How much faith do you have that in the 21st century, the average American citizen is up to that task? How optimistic are you for democracy going forward? Thank you.
Thank you. And there is one more person. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, you've covered a lot of general notions and also seem to be focused more on print media. And I understand that a large percentage of people get their information from TV, especially TV news. And I'm wondering what you think in terms of influence and accuracy of the 24-hour cable news as well as the network news, and now with the proliferation of foreign news sources like BBC, French News, DW, NK, RT, which has got slammed as being more propaganda recently. You know, I'd kind of like to get your impression about all of that.
Thank you. So I'm going to do reverse order, starting with Tamara and coming back this way. And you can address any of the questions that were laid out.
With the last question, I mean, video news releases and, like, again, promotional stuff that's been around for a long time. I think that the idea about technology, I mean, I think technology has done something different with our ability to control some of old problems, like, admittedly, old problems. And I don't, you know, I don't know exactly what the solution is, but it feels like some of the things I mentioned should be. But this idea about every citizen being their own editor, let me just say that part of the thing I feel like is that the Constitution also is supposed to protect equality. And advertisers would love to have this be adopted as the standard, right? Because they know they've invested billions of dollars for, you know, 50 years, maybe 100 years in fine-tuning your reactions to product placements, to this place on the shelf where things are, to all of this structuring of the environment to which the individual consumer, whether of news or a product, is no match. And asking us to do that as individuals is both unrealistic and burdensome. And I think that taking that burden away from us is one of the things that we ask a government to do for us, those things that we are not able to do for ourselves, which is in some cases, sometimes providing some sort of information about what's reliable and what's not, who's the truthful advertiser, who's not. I understand that this is really controversial, but I'm...
I'm glad you're here, though. It's a great topic. And, you know, we already do this in the commercial speech realm, right? And et cetera. And other...
Well, actually, we're moving away from it in the commercial speech
used to.
realm. But we used to do it. And, you know, it kind of jogged along okay for a while.
Thanks. So, Brent, what about you?
So I will try to get to all three real quickly. On the are Americans up for the task thing, I mean, I guess I'm an optimist on this and would say yes. I think the biggest challenge, the two biggest challenges are, A, we're all pushed for time. I mean, we're all super busy, and you are bombarded constantly with information, right? And you have to have a way to filter that out, particularly when your attention is lots of different places, your job, your family, everything else, right? So, I mean, that's part of the challenge on that. I mean, I think ideally what I want is you want people to engage with trusted news sources, and, you know, there's all sorts of different sources that emerge all the time, and, you know, ideally what you do is you'd interact with them, and over time you'd develop an opinion about whether this is a trustworthy source or not, or if I'm going to take what they have to say with a grain of salt, or, you know, I do think if given the time and the interest, people are sort of up to the task. As far as the 24-hour news cycle, I mean, my general impression has always been that a lot of times when people complain about the media, sometimes they're talking more about TV than print. I mean, I think part of that is, you know, whether you're on MSNBC or CNN or Fox or whatever, you have reporters reporting something along with sort of pundit-type talking heads that are all kind of blended together, right? So you're getting news and you're getting people's sort of analysis or spin on it all at the same time. And so that would never happen in what I do. So, yeah, I don't write a story and then 500 words in, somebody from our editorial board gets to weigh in for the next 500 words and say whether, you know, so there's a different sort of way that I think people interact with these sorts of things on television that you don't really have in print. And, you know, and I think that's a challenge. And the 24-hour news cycle, I mean, again, people want viewers. You get some kind of hot story and everybody throws everything they've got at this, and it's just on and on and on. And then you can get things that are over-amplified more than they need to be. I don't know necessarily how you fix that. As far as your point, I've never had anybody say, can you sexy this up, that I'm aware of in my newsroom. What you do hear regularly is, I mean, there is a push to write compelling stories, which I think is entirely legitimate. Tell people a story. Tell them why they should care. Connect this to their lives. And if you have information that makes this more interesting, don't make it boring. Don't make it dry. You know, and the one challenge, and, you know, it translates some things. If government officials say something with jargon, and you know, and they're sort of talking about a topic that you can then help people by expanding out and explaining why they should care, or what this person really said in layman's terms, right? So you want to tell people as compelling a story as you can without crossing that line where you're making it so compelling that it then, I mean, some things by definition just maybe are less interesting than other things, right? But are important and you need to report on. I mean, there's a line that you want to adhere entirely to what the news is and what the reality of the situation is, but you want to tell the best story you can, staying within those boundaries.
Right, and I think you now have the last word, Matt.
So let me try and take at least a couple of these. On the issue of TV versus print, I think the reality is that the lines between these are rapidly blurring. And I think we're a small number of years away from the point when there's really not going to be a meaningful distinction between online and offline. The issues that are most sort of talked about and most salient in the context of fake news typically are associated with the social media platforms first and foremost, with the mainstream media, television and print, sort of oftentimes reflecting rather than causing the sort of surge in a story that might later turn out not to be true. So whenever I talked about that line between slanted or not necessarily contextually accurate information on the one hand and downright falsehoods on the other, seems to me you're more likely to see the former online and the former offline and the latter online. But I think that in the big picture sense, this is a problem across media, and it's going to be increasingly difficult to distinguish between these different sectors. In terms of are Americans up to it, and hearkening back to the golden age, I mean, I would start with, which I talk to my students about this all the time. There was no golden age. You know, it's very easy to forget that prior to maybe the 1930s, nobody trusted the media. That was yellow journalism. You know, the media was portrayed in Hollywood and on Broadway as slimy ambulance chasers. You know, the most popular play of the decade of the 1930s was The Front Page, and if you go back and take a look at that, it'll give you an idea of what people thought about journalism. Then there was a big investment by some of the New York publishing magnates in professionalizing journalism, and that sort of took off after World War II, and so we have this period of greater trust in media, but more generally, a lot more trust in public institutions by Americans. Now, were they wise to trust public institutions more than they do now? Are Americans unwise not to trust them today? I mean, a lot of bad stuff happened that nobody questioned back in the golden age. So, you know, it's easy for me to hindsight and say, gosh, if only there was some more skepticism. But in general, I think, you know, people haven't really, for the most part, changed very much. You know, the institutions certainly have changed, and certainly we've seen a great increase in polarization in government, and I think polarization explains a lot of the eroding trust in institutions, all the things that follow from polarization. But I don't, you know, are Americans up to democracy? I think you could ask that question at any point in our history, and, you know, I mean, I guess I'm not quite the optimist. I think Americans have been able to enjoy democracy, and you know, I think someone correct me if they're wrong, but was it George Washington who said that it's there, we'll see if you can keep it? And I think it was George Washington. But in any case, I think that's right, and it's not clear that it's there because of Americans, but that they've been able to not lose it yet is, you know, a stroke of fortune, and, you know, that it may yet happen.
Well, on that note, I want to thank our panel. And I'm inviting up Amanda, the editor-in-chief, to make some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all of our moderators and our panels for informing today's discussion. We couldn't have done this without you and had such wonderful conversations, so thank you again. For those of you who have made your first pilgrimage to Vermont, we certainly hope it won't be your last, especially considering the extra warm weather we ordered for you today. And you're always welcome back to our campus to spark the lively discussion that you did, so thank you very much. I'm going to go back to something that Elliot said, one of our symposium editors this morning. He said, we're lucky to live in a society where we have First Amendment protections, but lucky isn't enough. And I think that the conversations today do in fact show that there's quite a lot of work to be done. And as legal scholars or members of the public, we have a role to play in asking some hard questions. Questions like, what are the solutions to FOIA's imperfections, even if that might be a generous characterization? Does it matter, or why do leakers leak, and does it matter, as Professor Dykes articulated in the second panel? And then how do we effectively combat fake news? So I think especially in Vermont Law School, where a lot of the people here want to dedicate their JD degree to some particular mission, whether that's climate change or social justice or maybe in the environment more broadly, these conversations have been very helpful today, and I think that this is really going to play a huge role in how the people here go about carrying out those missions after graduation. I would again like to give a major thank you to several people in the room without whom today could not have happened. Elliot and Sylvia, our symposium editors. They did a great deal over the summer to make sure that this room was an efficient and effective marketplace of ideas come September 15th. And I think that their efforts have paid off. I would also like to take a moment to recognize Professor Teachout, Professor Taub, and Professor Dykes. If you could please stand. We were given a lot of help over the summer in how to shape the content and the composition of these panels, and without their help, we certainly could not have pulled any of this off. I would also be remiss to not thank the staff editors on Vermont Law Review for all of their help. And yes, clap. And as well as Martina and her staff for the lovely lunch and breakfast that they provided to us. And also, many thanks to all of you who have come to learn something today. I speak on behalf of the entire Law Review, and I thank Vermont Law School when I say that I'm very pleased to see that there's such curiosity and piqued interest for a topic we decided to showcase this year. So thank you all very much for coming. I will remind the panelists to please join us in Yates at 4 o'clock. And thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.